Imagine being at the center of a frantic hospital where every second can decide between life and death. Dr. Pedro Costa, a surgeon famous for his skills and compassion, faces a dilemma that will test his limits of courage and ethics. Pedro is forced to make a decision that will forever change his life and the lives of many others around him due to a desperate mother, a child on the brink of death, and a relentless healthcare system. This is a story about sacrifice, resilience, and the ability to follow one's heart in a world where the rules are not always fair. Dr. Pedro Costa was a well-known surgeon at Santa Helena University Hospital, renowned for his technical skills and depth of heart. He was a true advocate for human life, regardless of circumstances, because his commitment to medicine went beyond surgical skills. The hospital followed its usual routine on a typical day. Nurses and doctors moved methodically through the corridors, treating patients and handling daily tasks. The calm atmosphere was abruptly interrupted. A desperate mother burst through the hospital entrance with her child in her arms. She screamed with tears streaming down her face, pleading for help for her very sick child. The child was pale and barely conscious. The receptionist refused service due to the hospital's strict policy. "We don't offer free care here, ma'am," she responded indifferently. At that moment, Pedro was walking through the corridor and heard the mother's pleas. His medical intuition combined with his strong sense of compassion led him immediately to the scene. He saw the mother's desperation and the critical state of the child. His mind was already racing, thinking about the possibilities and consequences of his choices. "What's going on here?" Pedro approached the receptionist. A bit hesitant at seeing the seriousness in Pedro's eyes, the receptionist replied, "The child is very sick but has no insurance." He didn't hesitate. "Don't worry, I'll take care of her," he said firmly, taking the child in his arms and heading quickly to the emergency room. He felt the disapproving looks of his colleagues as he walked, but his determination didn't waver. Every second was important to him. Pedro placed the child on a stretcher and began giving precise orders to the nursing team in the emergency room. His calm but urgent voice said, "I need an IV now." The team followed his instructions and moved quickly. Although Pedro was breaking hospital rules, his primary interest was saving the child's life. He focused entirely on the task of stabilizing the young patient, ignoring the murmurs and expressions of disapproval around him. The tension in the emergency room began to stabilize as emergency procedures were conducted. The child started showing better vital signs, and her breathing became more consistent. Pedro felt a brief relief, but knew his decision would have consequences. He was willing to face any consequences because he believed that medical ethics and commitment to human life were above any policy or administrative regulation. When the hospital director, Miguel, opened the emergency room door abruptly, Pedro was fully concentrated on stabilizing the child. Miguel was known for being extremely strict about hospital rules and policies. As he approached Pedro, his expression was one of disapproval. "Pedro, what do you think you're doing? You know we can't treat uninsured patients here," Miguel said in an authoritative and exasperated voice. Pedro continued working, inserting a needle into the small patient's vein without looking up. "Miguel, I can't let a child die at our doorstep, not while I can do something to help," Pedro replied firmly. For a moment the room was silent, with the medical team's eyes alternating between Pedro and Miguel. The tension was palpable. Miguel sighed heavily, realizing he couldn't pull Pedro away from the moment. "Pedro, you're risking your position," the director said, lowering his voice so only Pedro could hear. "If this child doesn't survive, the responsibility will be yours." Finally, Pedro looked up to meet Miguel's gaze. "So be it," Pedro said. He returned his attention to the child and added, "I'd rather face the consequences than live with the guilt of doing nothing." The nursing team silently observed the clash of principles between the doctor and the director. Pedro continued working with precision and speed, stabilizing the child. Every stabilized heartbeat was a small victory. As the onlookers watched the delicate recovery of the child, Pedro muttered to himself, "I hope I'm doing the right thing." The mother's initial desperation began to give way to cautious relief. Although still apprehensive, she looked at Pedro with gratitude. Her voice choked with emotion as she expressed her thanks to the doctor. Pedro nodded and focused on the details of the surgery. Although he was aware that his decision to prioritize the child's life over hospital policies would receive criticism, he was prepared to defend his actions. The girl was stabilized after the procedure. Although Pedro experienced brief relief, he knew the great challenge was yet to come. Many might not understand or support the difficult decision he had made. Pedro, however, knew that human life was non-negotiable. He looked at the mother and child, now asleep and safe, and knew he would make the same choice again, regardless of the consequences. The tension in the emergency room remained high as Pedro finished stabilizing the child. The gravity of the situation and the risks Pedro was taking were known to the medical team. The hospital administration would not look kindly on the decision to bypass strict hospital policies to save a life. The imposing figure of Miguel, the hospital director, appeared as the emergency room door opened again with more force. Miguel entered the room with quick steps, his expression tense and eyebrows furrowed, clearly showing his disapproval. "Pedro, what do you think you're doing?" "You know we can't treat uninsured patients here," he repeated in a sterner tone. Pedro, still focused on inserting a needle into the small patient's vein, replied without looking up, "Miguel, I can't let a child die at our doorstep. Not while I can do something to help." Pedro's and Miguel's ideals clashed. On one side, the inflexible application of hospital policies focusing on financial sustainability and regulatory compliance. On the other, Pedro's unwavering devotion to medical morals and the preservation of life. Pedro was taking a risk, and the nursing team watched in silence, admiring his courage. Miguel approached Pedro and lowered his voice to speak privately. "Pedro, you're risking your position. If this child doesn't survive, the responsibility will be yours, and so will the consequences," the director warned. Pedro looked directly at Miguel. "So be it," Pedro replied. Continuing to treat the patient, he firmly said, "I'd rather face the consequences than live with the guilt of doing nothing." The conflict of values was silently observed by the medical team. Miguel sighed heavily, seeing Pedro's determination. The disapproval remained, although his expression softened a bit. He couldn't ignore Pedro's willingness to risk everything for his values. "I hope you know what you're doing," Miguel muttered as he left the room. Pedro returned his attention to the child, whose condition was slowly stabilizing. He knew his decision to not follow hospital policies would have consequences, but his choice was clear. The goal of medicine has always been to save lives, regardless of the rules. As he worked, he felt both the weight of administrative decisions and the lightness of a clear conscience for doing the right thing. A visibly distressed nurse abruptly opened the emergency room door as Pedro was treating the child. "Doctor, it's urgent. The mayor has been admitted with a heart attack. His condition is critical. We need you immediately," the nurse said, alarmed. Pedro quickly glanced at the monitor showing the girl's vital signs. The decision was difficult for him, but he knew what he had to do. "I can't leave now. This girl is still unstable. Call Dr. Almeida," Pedro instructed. The nurse disagreed. "Dr. Almeida is finishing another surgery." "Doctor, you're the only one available," the nurse insisted, increasing the tension in the room. Pedro took a deep breath and remained firm. "Prepare the mayor for treatment and do everything possible. I'll finish here and be there as soon as I can," he said. Moments later, Ramon, the director, entered the room, his tense expression reflecting the gravity of the situation. "Pedro, you must go immediately. The mayor is a public figure. This is vital for us," Ramon stated. Pedro responded without taking his eyes off the girl. "Ramon, no patient is less important than another while they are under my care," Pedro said, almost finishing the procedure. The room was filled with tension. Pedro knew that every second was crucial for both the girl and the mayor. He worked with precision and speed, but he did not take lightly the decision to give more importance to the child's life than the mayor's. "I'm almost done here," Pedro said, instructing the staff to care for the mayor until he arrived. Finally, after a long wait, the girl's breathing stabilized, and her vital signs improved significantly. Pedro breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the worst was over. "I'll go see the mayor now," he declared as he was about to leave the room. But the nurse returned with a sad expression. "Dr. Costa, we just lost the mayor. she said, delivering the news forcefully. Pedro paused and thought about the words. It was devastating to see the impact this would have on his career and the hospital. Ramon's expression now mixed indignation with compassion as he placed a hand on Pedro's shoulder. "Pedro, you did what you thought was right, but I'm afraid the board won't take this well," the nurse continued. Pedro looked at the girl, now sleeping peacefully, and decided he would do it all again despite the consequences. A life saved was a life won. Pedro's decision and the news of the mayor's death quickly spread through the hospital. Murmurs about what had happened flooded the environment. Pedro was exhausted but knew he would have to deal with the consequences of his choice. He was aware that breaking hospital policies would not go unnoticed. Pedro was quietly preparing breakfast the next morning when he saw through the window a line of black cars parked in front of his house. As he quickly descended the stairs, he encountered Dona Clara, the mayor's widow, surrounded by advisors and security guards. Her expression was intense and pained. "Dr. Costa, why was my husband left to die while you tried to save another life?" she asked directly. Pedro maintained his composure, aware of the press's attentive gaze. "Dona Clara, I am deeply saddened by your loss. I did everything I could to save both your husband and the little girl. Every life is equally valuable to me," Pedro said, in an effort to demonstrate his sincerity. The widow was still processing his words, her expression marked by anger and anguish. "You'll have to face the consequences of your actions. I won't tolerate this," she said with determination, her chin raised. Pedro restrained himself from saying that all patients were important, but decided it would be best not to make things worse. "I am prepared for that, and I would do it again if necessary because I believe my responsibility is to save lives without distinction," Pedro said, expressing his determination and concern for the future in a firm voice. Pedro returned to the hospital after the confrontation and was immediately called to the director Ramon's office. When he entered, the air was heavy, and Ramon stood looking out the window with a rigid posture. "Pedro, this situation is untenable. The mayor's death under our supervision and your decision to prioritize another patient have put the hospital in a very delicate position," Ramon said without turning to face him. Pedro felt the intensity of each word. "Ramon, I did what my medical oath demands. I saved a life that was in my hands," Pedro said, feeling that his justifications were not enough for the future. "Pedro, I understand your reasons, but the consequences are too great to be ignored. I'm under a lot of pressure." Ramon finally turned to face him, saying, "I'm sorry, but you can no longer work at this hospital." The news spread quickly. Pedro left the director's office with the weight of the world on his shoulders. Saying a silent goodbye to the place he had dedicated so much of his life to, he looked around the hospital corridors. However, an alarm sounded in the corridor before he could complete the resignation process. Pedro received an unexpected visit from the mayor's widow, Dona Clara, a few days after his dismissal. The black cars arriving in front of his house already indicated something serious was coming. Pedro quickly went upstairs and found Dona Clara surrounded by advisors and security guards. Her demeanor conveyed pain and severity. "Dr. Costa, why was my husband left to die while you tried to save another life?" she asked emotionally. Pedro felt the importance of the question. He knew his response could be misunderstood but needed to be honest. "Dona Clara, I am deeply saddened by your loss. I understand your concern, but when I arrived to help your husband, it was already too late. I did everything I could to save both your husband and the little girl. Every life is equally valuable to me," Pedro said, in an effort to demonstrate his sincerity. Dona Clara was evidently distressed, but there was also a flicker of anger in her eyes. "What do you plan to do now?" she asked. "I won't let this go unpunished, so you'll have to face the consequences of your actions," she said with determination, her chin raised. Pedro kept his focus. "I'm prepared for that, and I would do it again if necessary because I believe my responsibility is to save lives without distinction," Pedro said, expressing his determination and concern for the future. Dona Clara, with pain still visible on her face, seemed to process his words. "What will you do if I choose to pursue justice?" she challenged. Pedro remained resolute despite the veiled threat. "Then I will face that as well," he replied without fear. I'm here to do what's right, not what's easy." The tension was evident in the air. Pedro knew that regardless of what she said, Dona Clara was deeply hurt and determined to seek justice for her husband's loss. He politely but firmly bid her farewell, making it clear he was ready to face the consequences of his choices. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get back to work," Pedro concluded, turning and closing the door. Pedro was deeply affected by the news of the mayor's death and the confrontation with Dona Clara. He was aware of the importance of disobeying hospital policies to save the child's life. However, Pedro knew there was a right decision. All lives were important and deserved to be saved, regardless of the rules or the patient's social status. He was prepared to defend his choices and face any repercussions. The next day, Pedro felt the weight of his responsibilities as he walked through the hospital corridors. He knew his journey was just beginning and that many obstacles awaited him. However, his commitment to medical ethics and his determination to save lives were unshakable. He was determined to follow what he believed was right, regardless of the consequences. After the confrontation between Pedro and Dona Clara, the tension at the hospital increased. Besides the mayor's death, the administration was under heavy pressure due to the negative attention the case attracted. Pedro, with an expression of seriousness, was called to the director's office where Ramon was waiting. Ramon began directly saying, "Pedro, the situation is untenable. The mayor's death under our supervision and your decision to prioritize another patient have put the hospital in a very delicate position." Pedro felt the intensity of each word, aware that the effects of his actions were about to fully manifest. "Ramon, I did what my medical oath demands. I saved a life that was in my hands." Pedro tried to justify his decision. "Pedro, I understand your reasons, but the consequences are too great to be ignored." "I'm under a lot of pressure," Ramon said with a voice full of anguish. "I'm deeply sorry, but you can no longer work at this hospital." The news spread quickly. As he left the director's office, Pedro felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. Saying a silent goodbye to the place where he had dedicated so many years of his life, he looked around the hospital corridors. Every step was a farewell to colleagues, patients, and the routine he knew so well. An alarm sounded in the corridor before he could complete the resignation process. Ramon's worried expression running towards Pedro made it clear that something was wrong. "I need your help, Pedro. There was an accident, and my daughter is in critical condition. You're the only one who can save her," Ramon said with a desperate and urgent voice. Knowing what had happened recently, Pedro hesitated for a moment. However, the urgency in Ramon's voice and the gravity of the situation prevented him from doing anything else. With renewed determination, Pedro ordered, "Take me to her." Pedro, despite being dismissed, and the nursing team hesitated to see him, but his determination dispelled all doubts. Pedro found the young girl unconscious with multiple injuries in the emergency room. He successfully organized the team and began administering first aid with calmness and precision. He examined the girl's vital signs and said, "We need to stabilize her for surgery quickly." He knew that his skill and speed would determine the life of Ramon's daughter, so every decision he made was crucial. After many tense minutes, the situation stabilized. Pedro felt a brief relief as he said, "She'll need surgery, but the worst is over." Ramon expressed great joy and gratitude, as his daughter was now out of immediate danger. "Thank you, Pedro. I was wrong about you," Ramon said, expressing renewed gratitude and respect. Pedro knew he would still face significant challenges, even after reconciling with Ramon. The dismissal was still in effect, and the consequences of his actions continued to escalate. Pedro, however, was more determined than ever to continue fighting for what he believed in, saving lives and fulfilling his medical oath, regardless of the consequences. Pedro began to ponder the gravity of his situation once Ramon's daughter was out of immediate danger. He had been dismissed, facing severe criticism and threats of legal action. However, something inside him knew the battle was far from over. The next morning brought an unexpected change. Pedro was at home reflecting on recent events when he received a call from Jaime, a former medical professor who now ran a community hospital in a poor area of the city. "Pedro, I saw what happened on the news. We need to talk," Jaime said, his voice conveying admiration and concern. Jaime explained that the community hospital had very few resources, and desperately needed dedicated and experienced doctors. We don't have the most modern equipment or the funding of large medical centers, but we have a community that desperately needs competent medical care, Jaime said with hope. Pedro listened intently. The idea of making a real difference in a place where his work was truly needed began to resonate with him. It sounds like a big challenge, Jaime. How can I be sure it will make a difference there without the necessary support? Pedro asked, weighing the pros and cons. I'll be honest, Pedro. It's a daily challenge, but I believe that with your skill and dedication, you can help us make significant improvements, Jaime replied, encouraging him. He continued to talk about the hospital's conditions and how the team struggled to improve the community's health despite the difficulties. Pedro felt more motivated as he remembered his choice to become a doctor. While he knew dealing with obstacles was part of the job, his principles were deeply tied to the chance to directly impact a poor community. Jaime, I need to think about it, Pedro said, ending the call and feeling the weight of another important decision in his life. Pedro spent a few days deeply contemplating his career and what truly mattered to him as a doctor. His desire to continue making a difference, no matter where, was strengthened by the support he received during the crisis. After a night of thought, Pedro made his decision. Early in the morning, he called Jaime with determination and firmness. I'm in. Let's make a difference where it's needed most, Pedro said. Jaime spoke with relief and joy. Pedro, I'm thrilled. You won't regret this. Jaime praised Pedro for the choice and said, let's start planning your transition. Pedro felt a surge of energy and motivation. He spent the rest of the day organizing his schedules to work at both hospitals simultaneously. Although he knew it would be exhausting, he was driven to help those in need. Pedro continued to struggle, despite finding a new job at the community hospital. His choice at Santa Helena University Hospital continued to have repercussions. He was sued by the mayor's widow for medical negligence. The trial was expected to be lengthy. During the initial hearings, the prosecutors argued that Pedro neglected his duties at the private hospital in favor of the community hospital, endangering the lives of patients relying on him at both hospitals. Dr. Costa, can you explain why you chose to remain at the community hospital knowing that a critical patient at Santa Helena needed your assistance? The prosecutor asked, his speech laden with accusations. Pedro took a moment to organize his thoughts before responding. Every decision I made was aimed at saving as many lives as possible. At that moment, several critical emergencies were being addressed at the community hospital, Pedro explained with a firm and clear voice. I made a choice based on the immediate needs of the patients. As the trial progressed, Pedro's defense worked hard to demonstrate his commitment and dedication to medicine. The testimonies of patients he treated at the community hospital strengthened his case. One particularly moving testimony came from a young man Pedro had treated after an extremely severe work accident. I was at death's door. The community hospital and Dr. Costa saved my life, the patient said in court, noting he wouldn't be there today without him. In addition to the emotional testimonies, Pedro's defense presented internal documents from Santa Helena University Hospital revealing negligent practices and cost-cutting measures that jeopardized patient safety. The files revealed emails among the administration discussing the reduction of critical resources, putting Pedro in a difficult position. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, these documents reveal something very troubling. Dr. Costa was placed in a situation where any action he took would have negative consequences, the defense attorney stated. The focus of the accusations began to shift from Pedro's actions to the hospital's administrative activities. After a prolonged, intense trial, the judge finally announced the verdict. In light of new evidence and context, this court absolves Dr. Pedro Costa of the charges of medical negligence. We recognize that his intentions were for a greater good, the judge declared. As Pedro absorbed the judge's words, the courtroom murmured. Though not completely free of errors in the eyes of the law, he felt vindicated, especially since the true failings of the system were revealed. As he left the courtroom, Pedro received applause from a group of grateful supporters and patients gathered outside. The community's support was evident, reinforcing his determination to continue improving healthcare access. Let's learn from this and improve, Pedro said to Jaime, who was by his side. Though the battle had been tough, It revealed what needed to be changed to save lives. With this determination, Pedro and Jaime began planning their next steps to rebuild their careers and improve the hospital, ultimately saving more lives. After being acquitted and recognizing his commitment to medical ethics, Pedro felt a renewed sense of purpose. He dedicated himself to the community hospital, where he encountered desperate patients and a motivated team. Every day at the community hospital was a new challenge and an opportunity to change the world. Initially viewed with suspicion by the community hospital staff, Pedro quickly earned their trust through his skill and dedication. After a complex surgery Pedro successfully conducted, Jaime commented, "It's impressive to see what's possible with so little." Determined to overcome the challenges of the community hospital, with its limited resources and constant demand, Pedro stood out for his efficiency and leadership skills. A terrible accident in the local community forced the community hospital to increase its capacity. The hallways turned into makeshift extensions of the ward, with every bed occupied. Pedro moved from room to room, operating and treating patients, trying to maintain calm amidst the chaos. Despite the intense pressure, Pedro's effectiveness and leadership skills shone through. During one of these hectic days, Pedro received an urgent call from Santa Helena University Hospital. A specific experience in complex cardiac surgery was needed for a critically ill patient. The decision seemed impossible. On one hand, dozens of patients needed attention at the community hospital, and on the other, a life that could be lost without his skills. Pedro looked around and saw the community hospital staff working hard under his supervision. "Jaime, I received a call from Santa Helena. Only I can perform an urgent surgery for a patient. How is the situation here?" Pedro asked, considering the pros and cons. Jaime, under pressure, replied, "We're at our limit, Pedro, but I understand the situation. We'll do our best here, but I'm afraid we'll lose some patients if you go." With a heavy heart, Pedro made a quick decision. "The private hospital has many patients here. I'll do my best to care for each one," Pedro said. "I'm not leaving." He returned to the ongoing work, striving to be quick and careful, demanding the utmost precision. He instructed the nurses at Santa Helena to care for the patient until he arrived. When the situation at the community hospital finally began to improve, Pedro got into his car and drove as fast as possible to Santa Helena. Though the patient was in a grave condition, Pedro did everything he could to stabilize and perform the necessary surgery to save their life. Despite the relief of not having to choose between patients, Pedro still felt the weight of his choices. Back at the community hospital, Pedro reflected on the tumultuous day. While he knew he had made the right decision, the responsibility still weighed heavily on his mind. Jaime tried to reassure Pedro, saying, "You saved many lives here today and there too." Jaime placed a comforting hand on Pedro's shoulder and said, "You did what you could, don't blame yourself." Pedro continued working, determined to make a difference whenever and wherever needed, despite the pressure and exhaustion. His unwavering devotion to medicine and ethics prepared him to face any obstacle, knowing his goal was not just to treat illnesses but to build a healthcare system that truly cared for people.